Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode on perks of being a teacher. On this week's episode, I'm going to be teaching you all about how I use essential questions in my classroom and the importance of including them, especially when you're doing project-based learning. I hope that you enjoy this episode and are able to learn something from it. Project-based learning is a huge passion of mine, and that's why I decided to actually create a video all about project-based learning a few weeks ago. If you haven't watched that video yet, I encourage you to do so before watching this week's episode. Essential questions are an important part of project-based learning because it gives students guidance and specificity in terms of what exactly they will be researching and inquiring about throughout their project-based learning journey. So I wanted to start with, what are essential questions? And some teachers call them thought-provoking questions, but the language that I use most commonly in my classroom is essential questions. So what are they? There's a variety of things that make an essential question. Firstly, essential questions are questions that give answers that are not yes or no. And when you're teaching students about essential questions, that is one of the first things that I communicate with them. It's something that they're easily able to understand and grasp, and it's a rule that they can very easily follow. Sometimes students will create questions where the answer may be yes or no, but if students can communicate the journey that they will take in order to arrive at their answer, and if that journey requires critical thinking and problem solving, then I will be open to letting students use a question that does provide a yes or no answer. Essential questions also promote critical thinking. That means that the answer should not be something that you can easily type into a Google search. Google searches are definitely part of the research process of essential questions. However, students should need to visit a variety of different websites and look at different sources in order to land with a good answer. Essential questions require support and justification. So that means that students cannot just claim that this is the answer to their question. They will definitely need to demonstrate the sources that they used in order to land at their answer. They should have a wealth of information that they have collected from their research, and they should be able to clearly explain why they landed at the answer that they did. Essential questions should also be able to be investigated over time. So this means that if a student creates an essential question today in my classroom, that within 10 years from now, students should be able to pick up that question and look at it again. It's likely that over time, however, the answer to such essential questions will change. Essential questions require deep critical thinking, not only in answering the questions, but also in the creation of them. Typically, students will spend at least an entire class coming up with the essential question that they will use to guide their research. Sometimes students will firstly research to gain knowledge about the topic that they have chosen for their project-based learning, and then after investigating their topic, they will come up with an essential question. Often it's hard for students to create an essential question if they don't know anything about the topic at all. Because I do encourage students through project-based learning to learn something new and to inquire about an area that they haven't heard of before, that is very common for students to firstly choose to research and then create their essential question. After the essential question is created, then students have focus to what exactly the purpose is of their project-based learning. So now that I've explained what essential questions are, I would like to show you how I teach students about it in my classroom. The first thing that I will do when I'm teaching students about essential questions is I will define it for them. So the same way that I define for you what essential questions are, I will do that for students. And once I define it, I also make sure that I ask students, have you ever heard of essential questions before? What do you know about essential questions? And that creates an entire learning community of students learning from me, but also learning from their peers. And quite often students have heard of essential questions before, but sometimes in the context of history or social studies or family studies, the courses I'm teaching this semester, they maybe haven't used them before. The second thing that I do when I am teaching students about essential questions is I will provide them with a variety of examples of questions. And I tell them that these questions possibly are essential questions, but they also might not be essential questions. And I have students decide for themselves whether they think the question they see is an essential question or is not. So the way that I do that is I will project for students examples of essential questions. I will firstly ask them to think to themselves, do you think this is an essential question or do you think it is not? Then I ask students to raise their hand if they think it is an essential question. I say hands down, and then I say raise your hand if you think it is not an essential question. I never like to put students on the spot during this learning time because for some students this will be the first time that they've learned about essential questions. Raising their hand is a great way for students to be able to participate without putting them on the spot and making them share in front of all of their peers. I do ask though, would anyone like to share why they think it was an essential question or not an essential question? Usually I will have a handful of students raise their hand and provide reasons both for and against why certain questions are not essential questions. Students seeing examples of questions is a great way for them to build an understanding of how they may choose to frame a question for their project-based learning cycle. The third way and last way that I teach students how to create essential questions is by giving them very, very general topics projected for them on the board. When they see the topic in groups, they have a total of 5 minutes to generate as many essential questions as they can. Having it timed gives them a bit of like a sense of urgency. Ooh, like how many can we come up with? And having them in groups allows them to collaborate with one another without having to share in front of the entire class. When students are creating their essential questions for the topic that I've given them, they record them on these huge whiteboard sheets. I love these whiteboard sheets because they're huge and give students a huge space that they can record their ideas. Typically, these whiteboards will be filled with tons of different questions based on the topic that I've shown them. The other value in including these whiteboard sheets is that when I ask students to share what questions they generated, they're all recorded right here and right in front of them, easy to share with the class. I will show students a total of 3 different topics that they will create essential questions for as a group. The topics that I give them are topics that I think they would have some kind of knowledge of, and they're vague and like broad enough that they should be able to come up with a wealth of essential questions. So the topics that I give students to create essential questions for in groups are food, social media, and education. Typically, this leads to a huge discussion with the class because the questions that students create are absolutely outstanding, and they give everyone tons to talk about in the class. This lesson on essential questions is one of my favorites that I do at the beginning of the school year with students. If you're choosing to start project-based learning in the middle of the school year or the middle of the semester, this is a fabulous lesson to use to have students practicing making essential questions and also gaining an understanding of what essential questions are. After this lesson, students are now ready to create their own essential questions for their project-based learning cycle. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode on how to create essential questions and the purpose of using essential questions in your classroom. Stay tuned for next week's episode on perks of being a teacher. As always, subscribe, comment below if you liked or disliked anything from this week's episode, and see you all next week. Bye, everybody.